You are listening to HOA Neighbor Wars. The HOA tried to weaponize a property line. I am standing in my front yard in Anchorage, Alaska, holding a tape measure, and the board president of the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association is screaming at me to stop work on a fence I have not even started building yet. Her name is Laura King, but everyone calls her Linda, and she is waving a laminated rule card in my face like it is a warrant. The post hole digger is leaning against a pile of dirt 10 feet away untouched because the contractor has not even shown up yet. Linda is yelling that I am in violation of setback rules, that I need board approval, that I am going to be fined daily starting tomorrow if I do not cease and desist right now. I just moved here 3 weeks ago. I work as a pool service technician, and I took this house because the price was right and I thought a quiet neighborhood would be a good reset after a rough year. I was wrong. The Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association is the kind of HOA where the neighborhood portal is full of fence photos and accusations, where every property line is a potential lawsuit, and where Linda runs the landscaping committee like a personal fiefdom. She is in my face before I can even say hello, telling me that the fence plan I submitted 2 weeks ago is not approved, that I never got written confirmation, and that she is calling management and she is going to be dramatic about it. I take a breath and try to stay calm, because I just moved in and I cannot afford to lose this place or get dragged into court. I say, Linda, I submitted the plan, I got an email that said it was under review, and the contractor is not even here yet. She cuts me off. She says, we can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. I blink. Tow what? The post hole digger? She does not answer. She just waves the laminated card again and tells me that if I start work without explicit written approval from the board, I will be fined $500 per day. And the HOA will seek an injunction to force removal of any structure I build. I ask to see the rule she is citing. She pulls the card back and says it is proprietary. I say, proprietary? She says, you signed the covenants when you closed. You agreed to abide by all rules and interpretations as determined by the board. I did sign the covenants, but I also read them. And nowhere did it say the board could invent new rules on the spot or refuse to show me what I am violating. I tell her I want to see the written approval process. She says, I am the approval process. I say, then approve it. She says, I cannot, because you did not follow the process. I ask what process? She says, you need to submit a site plan, a survey, a materials list, and a letter from your contractor confirming compliance with city code. I say I submitted all of that. She says, you did not submit a letter from your contractor. I say, yes, I did. It was attached to the email. She says, I never received it. I pull out my phone and show her the sent email with the attachment. She glances at it, waves her hand and says, that does not count. You need a notarized letter. I say, the rules do not say notarized. She says, the board interprets the rules, and we require notarization for contractor statements. I say, fine, I will get it notarized. Can I proceed once I do? She says no, because the plan itself is not compliant. I say, what is not compliant? She says, the fence height. I say, it is 6 feet, which is the maximum in the covenants. She says, the covenants say 6 feet maximum, but the board has determined that 6 feet is too high for front yard setbacks, and we require 5 feet maximum in the front yard setback zone. I say, my fence is in the backyard. She says, your fence crosses the side yard, and the side yard is considered a front yard setback for purposes of height restrictions. I stare at her. I say, that makes no sense. She says, it is in the board minutes from last year. I say, Can I see the minutes? She says, they are not public. I say, I am a homeowner, I have a right to see the minutes. She says, you can request them in writing, and the board will review your request within 30 days. I say, Linda, the contractor is coming tomorrow. She says, then you better tell him not to start. I say, I already paid him a deposit. She says, that is your problem. I say, Linda, I followed the rules, I submitted everything, and you are making up new requirements as we go. She says, I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it. She pulls out her phone and starts dialing. I stand there, holding the tape measure, watching her, and I realize this is not about the fence. This is about control. This is about Linda flexing on the new guy to show everyone in the neighborhood that she is the one who decides what gets built and what does not. I look at the post hole digger leaning against the pile of dirt. I look at the orange reflective marker Linda planted at my curb this morning. Like a warning, like a claim. I look at the laminated rule card she is still waving. I take the fine notice without flinching, because I know what it will trigger. I do not say that out loud. I just nod and tell her I will contact the management company myself. She smirks and says, good luck with that. The next morning, I call the management company. I get a recorded message that says they will respond within 3 business days. I leave a message explaining the situation, the submitted plan, the email trail, and Linda's demand for a notarized contractor letter that was never in the original requirements. I also mention that Linda told me the board interprets the rules and that I have no right to see the board minutes without a 30-day review. I keep my tone calm and professional. I do not mention that Linda planted an orange marker at my curb or that she threatened to tow equipment I do not even have yet. I hang up and text my contractor, a guy named Rick who has worked in this neighborhood before. I tell him what happened. He texts back, Linda King? Yeah, she pulled the same thing on another job last year. We had to delay 3 weeks while they sorted out what the rules actually were. I ask, did you win? He says they let us build, but they changed the rules right after so no one else could do what we did. I say, that is insane. He says, that is the reserve. I ask if he has photos and timestamps from the day Linda interfered. He says, I have everything. I document every job because of people like her. I say, send me copies. I might need them. He says, already on the way. 10 minutes later, my email pings and I have a zip file with photos, timestamps, and a timeline of every interaction Rick has had with the reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association over the past 2 years. I open it and start reading. It is a gold mine. Rick documents every delay, every rule change, every time Linda showed up on a job site and demanded something new. There are photos of Linda standing in front of equipment, blocking access, taking pictures of workers, and calling the police to report trespassing when contractors were on homeowner property with permission. There are emails where Linda tells homeowners their projects are not approved, followed by emails from the management company saying the projects were approved weeks earlier, but Linda never forwarded the notifications. There are meeting minutes where Linda proposes rule changes mid-meeting and the board votes without homeowner input. I print everything and put it in a tabbed binder. I tuck the binder under my arm and go outside. The orange reflective marker is still at my curb. I leave it there. It is evidence. That afternoon, I get an email from the management company. It says my fence plan is under review, and I should not proceed until I receive written approval. It does not say why the plan is under review or what is wrong with it. It does not mention the notarized letter. It does not mention the height restriction Linda invented. It just says under review. I reply and ask for specifics. I attach the original submission, the contractor letter, and the email trail showing I submitted everything 2 weeks ago. I also attach a copy of the covenants with the section on fences highlighted. I say, I followed the process, I submitted all required materials, and I need clarification on what is missing or non-compliant. I also say, I was informed by a board member that the board has determined a 5-foot height limit for side yards, but this is not in the covenants, and I have not seen any board minutes or amendments documenting this change. I request copies of any board minutes or policy updates related to fence height restrictions. I hit send and wait. An hour later, Linda is at my door. She is holding a clipboard with a stack of papers. She says, "You are causing problems." I say, "I am asking questions." She says, "You are questioning the board." I say, "I am questioning a rule that does not exist in the covenants." She says, "The board has the authority to interpret and enforce the covenants as needed to maintain property values and neighborhood standards." I say, "I agree, but interpretation is not the same as invention." She says, "Are you calling me a liar?" I say, "I am saying I have not seen the rule you are citing, and I have a right to see it before I am fined for violating it." She says, "The rule is in the board minutes from last year." I say, "Great. Can I see them?" She says, "I already told you, you need to submit a written request." I say, "I just did. I emailed the management company an hour ago." She says, "They will forward it to the board, and the board will review it at the next meeting." I say, "When is the next meeting?" She says, 3 weeks. I say, "Linda, the contractor is scheduled for next week. I cannot wait 3 weeks." She says, "Then you should have thought of that before you started a project without approval." I say, "I did get approval. I submitted the plan and I got a confirmation email." She says, "That was not approval. That was acknowledgement of receipt." I say, "It said the plan was under review and I would be notified if there were any issues." She says, "This is the notification." I say, "This is you standing on my porch inventing rules." She says, "I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it." She pulls out her phone and dials. I stand there and listen. She says, "Hi, this is Laura King. I am the landscaping committee lead for the reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. I am standing at the property of a homeowner who is refusing to comply with board directives and is threatening to proceed with unpermitted construction." I hear a voice on the other end. Linda says, "Yes, he submitted a plan, but he did not follow the process and he is now arguing with me about board authority." She listens. She says, "No, he did not submit a notarized contractor letter." She listens. She says, "I told him he needs one." She listens. She says, "It is in the board interpretation of the covenant section on contractor accountability." She listens. She says, "I do not have the exact meeting date in front of me, but it is in the minutes and I can send them over later." She listens. She hangs up. She looks at me and says, "The management company agrees with me. You are out of compliance and you cannot proceed." I say, "What did they actually say?" She says, "They said you need to submit a notarized letter." I say, "Did they say anything about the height restriction?" She says, "They did not need to. It is already board policy." I say, "Linda, you are lying." She smiles. She says, "Prove it." She turns and walks away. I watch her go. I pull out my phone and call the management company back. I get the same recorded message. I leave another message, this time asking for a written summary of the call Linda just made and a copy of any board policy requiring notarized contractor letters. I also ask for the date and content of the board meeting where the 5-foot side yard height restriction was adopted. I say I am requesting this under the Washington State Homeowners Association Act, which allows homeowners to inspect association records. I hang up and realize I just cited the wrong state. I am in Alaska. I look up Alaska HOA law on my phone. Alaska does not have a specific Homeowners Association Act, but it does have general nonprofit corporation law that applies to HOAs, and homeowners do have a right to inspect records. I call back and leave a third message correcting my citation and referencing Alaska Statutes Title 10, Chapter 20, which covers nonprofit corporations. I say I am formally requesting access to all board meeting minutes, policy updates, and rule interpretations related to fence construction and height restrictions. I say I am requesting this in writing, and I expect a response within 10 business days as required by law. I hang up. I feel like I just declared war. I probably did. 2 days later, I get a letter in the mail. It is from the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. It is a violation notice. It says I am in violation of Covenant Section 12, subsection C, which governs exterior modifications and requires advance written approval from the board for any construction, alteration, or addition to the exterior of the property. It says I have proceeded with construction without approval, and I am subject to a fine of $500 per day until the violation is cured. It says the cure deadline is tonight at midnight, and daily fines will begin tomorrow. I read it twice. I have not started construction. I have not even had the contractor show up. The only thing on my property is a post hole digger leaning against a pile of dirt, and that belongs to Rick, not me. I take a photo of the letter. I take a photo of the post hole digger. I take a photo of the pile of dirt. I take a photo of the orange reflective marker at the curb. I send all of it to Rick and ask, "Did you do any work on my property?" He texts back, "No. I dropped off the digger and some stakes to mark the line, but I have not dug anything or set any posts." I ask, "When did you drop it off?" He says, 3 days ago. I say, "So the digger has been sitting there for 3 days and no work has been done?" He says, "Correct." I say, "Linda is claiming I have started construction without approval, and she is fining me $500 per day starting tomorrow." He says, "That is insane. I can send you a statement confirming no work has been done." I say, "Notarized?" He says, "If you need it." Yeah. I say, "Send it." An hour later, I have a notarized statement from Rick confirming that he delivered equipment to my property, but has not performed any construction, excavation, or installation work. I scan it and email it to the management company with a copy of the violation notice. I say, I am attaching a notarized statement from my contractor confirming that no construction has occurred on my property. The violation notice is factually incorrect, and I am requesting immediate withdrawal of the notice and cancellation of any fines. I also request a written explanation of how the board determined that construction had occurred when no construction has occurred. I hit send. I wait. Nothing. I call. Recorded message. I leave another message. Still nothing. I text Rick and say, "I think Linda is just making things up as she goes and hoping I give up." He says, "Yeah, that is her strategy." I say, "What do I do?" He says, "Document everything, do not pay any fines, and show up at the next board meeting with everything you have." I say, "The next meeting is 3 weeks away." He says, "Request a special hearing. The bylaws usually allow homeowners to request one with 48 hours notice." I pull up the bylaws on the HOA website. He is right. Section 7. Subsection B says any homeowner may request a special hearing to address a dispute or violation notice by submitting a written request to the board president or the management company. The board must schedule the hearing within 7 days of the request. I draft a letter requesting a special hearing. I cite Section 7, Subsection B. I attach copies of the violation notice, the notarized contractor statement, the original fence plan submission, the email trail, and the photos showing no construction has occurred. I send it to the management company and I copy Linda. I also send a hard copy via certified mail. I do all of this before midnight. The cure deadline passes. I do not cure anything, because there is nothing to cure. The next morning I check my mailbox. There is another letter from the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. It is a fine notice. $500 for day 1. It says the fine will continue daily until the violation is cured, or the board grants a variance. It says I have 10 days to pay, or the fine will be added to my account and I will be subject to a lien on my property. I photograph the notice. I email it to the management company and say, I have not started construction, I have provided proof that no construction has occurred, and I have requested a special hearing. I am not paying this fine. Please confirm receipt of my hearing request and provide a hearing date. I hit send. I wait. An hour later, my phone rings. It is the management company. A woman named Sarah introduces herself and says she is the community manager for the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. She says she received my emails and my hearing request. She says the board has reviewed my request and they are willing to schedule a hearing, but they need to see the notarized contractor letter first. I say I already sent it. She says, I do not see it in the file. I say, I attached it to my email 2 days ago. She says, let me check. I hear typing. She says, oh, here it is, I see it now. She says, okay, this confirms no work has been done, so I will ask the board to withdraw the violation notice and cancel the fines. I say, thank you. She says, however, the board still needs to review your fence plan before you can proceed. I say, the plan has been under review for 2 weeks. What is the holdup? She says, the board has some concerns about the height and the setback. I say, the height is 6 feet, which is the maximum in the covenants, and the fence is in the backyard. She says, the board interprets the side yard as part of the front yard setback for height purposes. I say, that is not in the covenants. She says, it is in the board minutes. I say, I requested copies of the board minutes and I have not received them. She says, I will send them over. I say, when? She says, today. I say, thank you. She says, one more thing. The board would like you to reduce the fence height to 5 feet in the side yard section. I say, why? She says, to maintain sight lines and property values. I say, my neighbors on both sides have 6-foot fences. She says, those were grandfathered in. I say, grandfathered from what? She says, the new policy. I say, what new policy? She says, the board adopted a new fence height policy last year. I say, was it voted on by the homeowners? She says, the board has the authority to adopt policies without a homeowner vote as long as they are consistent with the covenants. I say, but this policy contradicts the covenants. She says, it interprets the covenants. I say, Sarah, I am not reducing the height. The covenants allow 6 feet and that is what I am building. She says, then the board will not approve your plan. I say, then I will build without approval and we can sort it out in court. She says, if you build without approval, the board will seek an injunction and you will be responsible for all legal fees. I say, If the board seeks an injunction based on a policy that contradicts the covenants, I will countersue for harassment and abuse of authority. She is quiet for a moment. She says, "Let me talk to the board and I will get back to you." She hangs up. I sit there, holding my phone, and I realize this is going to get worse before it gets better. That afternoon, I get an email from Sarah with an attachment. The attachment is a PDF of board meeting minutes from 11 months ago. I open it and start reading. The minutes are from a regular monthly meeting. There are 7 items on the agenda. Item 5 is titled Fence Policy Update. The minutes say, the board discussed homeowner complaints about tall fences blocking views and reducing property values. The board reviewed the covenant language and determined that the 6-foot maximum should apply only to rear yards and that side yards should be limited to 5 feet to maintain sightlines. The board voted to adopt this interpretation and to require all new fence projects to comply. The vote was 3-2. I read it again. It does not say the board amended the covenants. It says the board adopted an interpretation. I scroll down. There is no mention of homeowner input. There is no mention of notice to homeowners. There is no mention of an amendment process. The board just voted, and that was it. I look at the date. 11 months ago. I search the HOA website for any notice or announcement about the fence policy update. Nothing. I search the neighborhood portal. Nothing. I email Sarah and say, "I received the minutes, thank you." I have a question. Was this policy change announced to homeowners? She replies, "The board minutes are posted on the website." I reply, "I checked the website, the minutes are not posted." She replies, "They are in the members only section." I reply, "I am a member, I logged in, I do not see them." She replies, "You need to request access." I reply, "How?" She replies, "Submit a written request to the board." I reply, "I already did." She replies, "The board will review it at the next meeting." I reply, "Sarah, this is circular." She does not reply. I call Rick and tell him what I found. He says, "Yeah, that is exactly what they did on my project. They voted to change the interpretation and then they enforced it retroactively on projects that were already in progress." I say, "That cannot be legal." He says, "It probably is not, but most people do not fight it because it costs more to hire a lawyer than it does to just rebuild the fence." I say, "I am not rebuilding." He says, "Then you are going to fight." I say, "Yeah." He says, "Good, I will back you up." I say, "I need more than that. I need proof that Linda is coordinating this." He says, "I might have something." He says, "Give me a day." I say, "What is it?" He says, "Let me confirm first." He hangs up. I sit there, staring at the email from Sarah, and I realize the board did not just adopt a policy, they adopted a strategy. They voted to create a new rule, they buried it in the minutes, they did not announce it, and now they are using it to block projects they do not like. And Linda is the enforcer. She is the one who shows up, waves the laminated card, and tells people they are out of compliance. She is the one who plants orange markers and calls the management company and makes sure everyone knows who is in charge. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos and satisfying endings. The next morning, Rick calls me. He says, "I found it." I say, "Found what?" He says, "The email chain." I say, "What email chain?" He says, Last year, when they pulled the same thing on my project, I requested all the board correspondence related to my fence plan. The management company sent me a file with emails between Linda and Sarah. One of the emails is from Linda to Sarah saying, "We need to slow down this project. The homeowner is not a good fit for the neighborhood, and I do not want his fence to set a precedent." Sarah replies and says, "I agree, but we need a policy basis to deny the plan." Linda replies and says, "Let me propose a height restriction at the next board meeting and we can apply it retroactively." Sarah replies and says, "That might not hold up if the homeowner challenges it." Linda replies and says, "Most people do not challenge, they just comply." I say, "Rick, that is evidence of intent." He says, "Yeah, and I am sending it to you right now." I say, "Wait, did you get permission to share this?" He says, "It is an HOA record. I requested it under Alaska law, and I own a copy. You can use it however you want." I say, "Thank you." He says, "One more thing. The email is dated 2 weeks before the board meeting where they voted on the policy." I say, "So Linda planned this in advance?" He says, "Yeah. She coordinated with Sarah to create a policy that would give her authority to block projects she did not like." I say, "That is not interpretation. That is conspiracy." He says, "Call it what you want, but it is in writing and it is time-stamped." I hang up and open my email. Rick has sent me a PDF with the full email chain. I read it 3 times. It is everything he said. Linda and Sarah coordinating to create a policy, to apply it retroactively, and to block projects based on personal preference. I print it. I add it to the binder. I tuck the binder under my arm and I go outside. The orange reflective marker is still at my curb. I leave it there. I take another photo. I text Rick and say, "I am ready for the hearing." He says, "When is it?" I say, "I do not know yet. Sarah said she would get back to me." He says, "Call her." I call Sarah. She does not answer. I leave a message. I say, "Sarah, I submitted a hearing request 4 days ago. I need a hearing date. Please call me back." I hang up. An hour later, Linda is at my door again. She is holding a clipboard. She says, "You need to stop harassing the management company." I say, "I am not harassing anyone. I am requesting a hearing." She says, "You are sending emails every day and making demands." I say, "I am exercising my rights under the bylaws." She says, "You are being disruptive." I say, "I am being thorough." She says, "The board has reviewed your request and we are denying the hearing." I say, "You cannot deny a hearing. The bylaws require you to schedule one within 7 days. She says, "The bylaws allow the board to deny frivolous requests." I say, "My request is not frivolous. I am being fined for a violation that did not occur." She says, "You started construction without approval." I say, "No, I did not. And I have a notarized statement from my contractor proving it." She says, "The board does not accept that statement." I say, "Why not?" She says, "Because the contractor has a financial interest in the outcome." I say, "Linda, the contractor is a neutral third party who documented the facts." She says, "He is not neutral. He is your contractor." I say, "He is also a witness." She says, "The board does not recognize him as a witness." I say, "The board does not get to decide who is a witness. That is for a judge to decide." She says, "Are you threatening to sue the HOA?" I say, "I am stating a fact." She says, "If you sue the HOA, you will lose, and you will be responsible for all legal fees, and you will be ostracized by the entire neighborhood. I say, Linda, I just want to build a fence. She says, then follow the rules. I say, I am following the rules. You are making up new ones. She says, I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it. She pulls out her phone. I say, go ahead. She dials. She says, hi, Sarah. I am standing at the property again. He is still refusing to comply, and now he is threatening to sue the HOA. I hear Sarah's voice on the other end. Linda says, yes. He said the board does not get to decide who is a witness, and that a judge will decide. She listens. She says, I agree. We need to escalate this. She listens. She says, I recommend we issue a stop work order and schedule an emergency board meeting to discuss legal action. She listens. She says, great, I will draft the motion tonight. She hangs up. She looks at me and says, you just made this a lot worse for yourself. I say, Linda, I have not done anything. She says, you have been combative and uncooperative since day one. I say, I have been asking questions. She says, you have been challenging the board. I say, I have been defending my rights. She says, your rights end where HOA authority begins. I say, that is not how rights work. She says, it is in the reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace. She turns and walks away. I watch her go. I pull out my phone and I call a lawyer. The lawyer's name is Mark. He specializes in HOA disputes. I explain the situation. I tell him about the violation notice, the fine, the hearing request, the email chain Rick sent me, and Linda's threat to escalate. He listens. He says, do you have copies of everything? I say, yes, I have a binder. He says, bring it to my office tomorrow morning. I say, how much is this going to cost? He says, I charge $300 per hour. But for HOA cases, I usually do a flat fee for the initial review and demand letter. I say, how much? He says, $1,500. I say, I do not have $1,500. He says, do you have the email chain showing coordination between the board member and the management company? I say, yes. He says, bring that, I will take a look, and we can talk about options. I hang up. I do not have $1,500. I used most of my savings for the down payment and the moving costs. I have about $2,000 in my checking account, and that needs to cover bills and food until my next paycheck. I sit down at the kitchen table and I look at the binder. I look at the email chain. I look at the violation notice. I think about what Linda said. Your rights end where HOA authority begins. I think about what Sarah said. If you build without approval, the board will seek an injunction and you will be responsible for all legal fees. I think about what Rick said. Most people do not fight it because it costs more to hire a lawyer than it does to just rebuild the fence. I think about my options. I can pay the fine and reduce the fence height and move on. I can hire a lawyer and fight and hope I win. I can build without approval and wait for the board to sue me. Or I can do what I have been doing. Document everything, request everything, and use the system against itself. I open my laptop. I draft a formal records request. I request copies of all board meeting minutes from the past 3 years. I request copies of all emails between board members and the management company related to fence projects. I request copies of all violation notices issued in the past 3 years. I request copies of all variance applications and approvals. I request copies of the HOA budget and financials. I cite Alaska Statutes Title 10, Chapter 20, which gives homeowners the right to inspect nonprofit corporation records. I say I am requesting these records for the purpose of determining whether the board has been consistent in its application of fence height policies and whether the board has followed proper procedures in adopting and enforcing interpretations of the covenants. I say I expect a response within 10 business days as required by law. I send the email to Sarah, and I copy the entire board. I also send a hard copy via certified mail. Then I draft another email. This one goes to every homeowner in the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. I use the neighborhood portal to get the email list. I say, "Hi neighbors, I am writing to let you know that I have been fined $500 per day by the HOA for allegedly starting construction on a fence without approval, even though no construction has occurred. I have provided proof that no work has been done, but the board has refused to withdraw the fine and has denied my request for a hearing. I have also discovered that the board adopted a new fence height policy last year that contradicts the covenants, and this policy was not announced to homeowners. I am sharing this because I believe the board is abusing its authority and I want other homeowners to be aware of what is happening. If you have had similar experiences with the board or the management company, please reach out to me. I am also requesting that the board hold a special meeting to address these issues and to allow homeowners to review and vote on any policy changes that affect property rights. Thank you." I include my phone number and my email address. I hit send. Within 10 minutes, my phone starts ringing. The first call is from a neighbor 2 streets over. She says, "Thank you for sending that email. Linda did the same thing to us last year and we ended up paying $3,000 in fines because we could not afford to fight it." I say, "What happened?" She says, "We wanted to replace our deck, and Linda said the design was not compliant, and she fined us daily until we agreed to hire a different contractor and use different materials." I say, "Did you request a hearing?" She says, "Yes," and they denied it. I say, "On what grounds?" She says, "They said the request was frivolous." I say, "That is exactly what they told me." She says, "Linda runs the board like a dictatorship, and no one challenges her because she will make your life miserable." I say, "I am challenging her." She says, "Good. Let me know if I can help." The second call is from a neighbor across the street. He says, "I got your email. I had a similar problem 2 years ago. Linda blocked my fence project for 6 months and I finally gave up and did not build it." I say, "Why did she block it?" He says, "She said it would block her view, but it was a 6-foot fence in my backyard and she lives 3 houses away." I say, "Did you fight it?" He says, "I tried, but the board always sided with her and I could not afford a lawyer." I say, "I cannot afford a lawyer either, but I am not backing down." He says, "I respect that." The third call is from Rick. He says, "I just saw your email to the neighborhood you are going to piss Linda off." I say, "Good." He says, "She is going to escalate." I say, "Let her." He says, "I am serious. She has connections and she will use them." I say, "What connections?" He says, "She knows people at the management company, she knows people at the city, and she has relationships with contractors and vendors. She can make things very difficult for you." I say, "She is already making things difficult." He says, "I know, but it is about to get worse." I say, "Rick, I appreciate the warning, but I am not stopping." He says, "Okay, just be ready." He hangs up. 10 minutes later, my phone rings again. It is Sarah. She says, "I just received your email to the neighborhood." I say, "Good." She says, "You are violating the covenants." I say, "How?" She says, The covenants prohibit homeowners from making defamatory statements about the board or the management company. I say, I did not make any defamatory statements, I stated facts. She says, you accused the board of abusing authority. I say, the board is abusing authority. She says, that is defamatory. I say, Sarah, truth is a defense to defamation. She says, you are creating a hostile environment. I say, I am informing homeowners of their rights. She says, you are undermining the board. I say, the board is undermining itself. She says, if you continue to send emails like this, the board will take action. I say, what action? She says, the board can impose fines for conduct that is detrimental to the community. I say, Sarah, you cannot fine me for exercising free speech. She says, this is not free speech. This is harassment. I say, no. Harassment is what Linda has been doing to me for the past 2 weeks. She is quiet for a moment. She says, I am recommending that the board hold an emergency meeting tomorrow night to address your conduct. I say, great, I will be there. She says, you are not invited. I say, it is an HOA meeting. I have a right to attend. She says, it is an executive session. It is closed to homeowners. I say, you cannot hold an executive session to discuss my conduct without allowing me to respond. She says, we can and we will. I say, Sarah, if the board takes any action against me in a closed meeting without giving me notice or an opportunity to respond, I will file a complaint with the state, and I will sue for violation of due process. She says, you do not have due process rights in an HOA. I say, yes, I do. HOAs are bound by their own bylaws and by Alaska Nonprofit Corporation Law, and both require notice and an opportunity to be heard before the board can impose sanctions. She is quiet. She says, I will talk to the board. She hangs up. I sit there holding my phone, and I realize I just went from defending a fence to fighting the entire HOA. That night, I get a knock on my door. It is a neighbor I have never met. He says, I got your email. I live 4 houses down, and I wanted to tell you that Linda tried to block my shed project 3 years ago. I say, what happened? He says, she said the shed was too close to the property line and she demanded I move it. I say, was it too close? He says, no. I had a survey and it was 5 feet inside my property line, which is more than the covenants require. I say, so what did you do? He says, I showed her the survey and she said the survey was wrong. I say, how can a survey be wrong? He says, she said the surveyor made a mistake and she demanded I hire a different surveyor. I say, did you? He says, no. I told her to pound sand and I built the shed anyway. I say, what did she do? He says, she fined me $1,000 and threatened to put a lien on my house. I say, did she? He says, she tried, but I went to the management company and I showed them the survey and I told them I would sue if they proceeded. They backed down. I say, so you won? He says, kind of. They withdrew the fine, but they also passed a new rule that all sheds require a second survey approved by the board. I say, that is insane. He says, that is Linda. I say, did you ever figure out why she targeted you? He says, yeah, she wanted my lot. I say, what? He says, she tried to buy my house 6 months before the shed issue, and I turned her down. She has been mad ever since. I say, she tried to use the HOA to force you out? He says, Yeah, and she will do the same to you if you let her. I say, I am not letting her. He says, good. If you need a witness or a statement, let me know. I say thank you. He leaves. I close the door and I think about what he said. Linda wanted his lot. Linda is using the HOA as a weapon to control the neighborhood and to punish people who do not fall in line. I think about the email chain Rick sent me. Linda coordinating with Sarah to create policies. I think about the board meeting minutes. Linda proposing rule changes and getting them passed without homeowner input. I think about the orange reflective marker at my curb. Linda marking territory. I sit down at my laptop and I start drafting a complaint. I address it to the Alaska Attorney General, Consumer Protection Unit. I say I am filing a complaint against the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association and its management company for abuse of authority, failure to follow bylaws, and harassment of homeowners. I attach copies of the violation notice, the fine notice, the hearing request, the denial, the email chain, the board meeting minutes, and the records request. I say the board has adopted policies that contradict the covenants. The board has refused to provide homeowners with notice or an opportunity to review policy changes. The board has imposed fines without evidence. And the board has denied homeowners the right to a hearing. I say I am requesting an investigation, and I am requesting that the state take action to ensure the HOA complies with Alaska law. I save the draft. I do not send it yet. I want to see what happens at the emergency board meeting tomorrow night. The next evening, I show up at the HOA clubhouse at 6:30. The parking lot is full. I recognize a few neighbors from the phone calls and the emails. I also see Linda's car. I also see Sarah's car. I walk inside. The meeting room is set up with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. Linda is sitting at the table with 4 other board members. Sarah is sitting off to the side with a laptop. There are about 20 homeowners in the audience. I take a seat in the front row. Linda sees me and her face tightens. She leans over and whispers something to Sarah. Sarah nods and stands up. She says, "This is an executive session. Homeowners are not permitted to attend." I say, "The bylaws require you to give notice before holding an executive session, and you did not give notice." Sarah says, "We posted notice on the website this morning." I say, "I checked the website at noon and there was no notice." Sarah says it was posted at 1. I say, "That is not adequate notice. The bylaws require 48 hours. Sarah says, "The bylaws allow the board to waive notice in emergency situations." I say, "What is the emergency?" Sarah says, "Your conduct." I say, "My conduct is not an emergency. It is a response to the board's misconduct." Linda stands up. She says, "You are out of order." I say, "No, you are out of order." She says, "I am the board president and I am directing you to leave." I say, "I am a homeowner and I have a right to attend this meeting." She says, "This is an executive session and you are not invited." I say, "You cannot hold an executive session to discuss my conduct without allowing me to respond." She says, "We can do whatever the board votes to do." I say, "Then take a vote." She looks at the other board members. She says, "All in favor of proceeding in executive session and excluding this homeowner, raise your hand." 3 hands go up. 2 do not. She says, "Motion passes, you need to leave." I say, "This is a violation of due process and I will be filing a complaint with the state." She says, "File whatever you want." I stand up. I look at the other homeowners in the room. I say, "You all heard this. The board just voted to exclude a homeowner from a meeting about his own conduct without giving him a chance to respond. Several people nod. One person says, "That is not right." Another person says, "We should all leave." Linda says, "If you leave, you will be marked as disruptive and you will be subject to fines." The room goes quiet. I say, "Linda, you cannot fine people for leaving a meeting." She says, "I can fine people for conduct detrimental to the community. And walking out of a board meeting is detrimental." I say, "No. Holding a secret meeting to punish a homeowner for asking questions is detrimental." She points at the door. She says, "Leave now, or I will call the police." I say, "Call them." She pulls out her phone. She dials. She says, "Hi, I need an officer at the reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Clubhouse. We have a homeowner who is trespassing and refusing to leave." I hear the dispatcher ask a question. Linda says yes, he is being disruptive and creating a safety concern. She hangs up. She looks at me and says, "You have 5 minutes." I look at Sarah. I say, "Are you going to allow this?" Sarah does not answer. I look at the other board members. I say, "Are you really going to let her call the cops on a homeowner for attending a meeting?" One of them, an older man, says, "I do not think this is right." Linda snaps at him. She says, "We already voted." He says, "I voted no." She says, "The majority voted yes, and that is final." I pull out my phone. I open the voice recorder app. I say, "I am recording this for the record." Linda says, "You cannot record a closed session." I say, "You cannot hold a closed session without proper notice." She says, "I am not arguing with you." I say, "Good, then let me stay and respond to whatever you are planning to discuss." She says no. I say, "Then I will wait outside for the police and I will show them the bylaws and the notice requirement and we will see what they say." I walk out. I stand in the parking lot. I look at my phone. The recording is running. I wait. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulls up. An officer gets out. He is young, maybe late 20s. He walks over and says, "Are you the homeowner?" I say yes. He says, "What is going on?" I say, "The HOA board is holding an executive session to discuss my conduct, and they refuse to let me attend or respond." He says, "Is this an HOA meeting?" I say yes. He says, "I do not get involved in HOA disputes." I say, "I understand, but they called you and claimed I was trespassing." He says, "Were you trespassing?" I say no. I am a homeowner and I have a right to attend meetings. He says, "Did they ask you to leave?" I say yes. He says, "Did you leave?" I say yes. He says, "Then there is no issue." I say, "The issue is they are violating their own bylaws." He says, "That is a civil matter. You need to talk to a lawyer." I say, "I am talking to a lawyer. But I also wanted you to know that they are using the police as a tool to intimidate homeowners." He looks at me. He says, "Did they threaten you?" I say, "The board president said she would call the police if I did not leave, and she told the dispatcher I was creating a safety concern when I was sitting quietly in a chair." He frowns. He says, "Do you have proof of that?" I say, "I recorded it." I pull out my phone and play the recording. He listens. He says, "Okay, I will talk to them." He walks into the clubhouse. I wait. 5 minutes later, he comes back out. He says, "I told them that filing a false report is a crime, and that if they call the police again without a legitimate safety concern, they could be charged." I say, "Thank you." He says, "For what it is worth, this sounds like a mess and you should probably get a lawyer." I say, "I am trying." He nods and gets back in his cruiser. He drives away. I stand there in the parking lot holding my phone, and I realize I just made an enemy of the entire board. I wait in the parking lot for another 30 minutes. The meeting is still going. I can see shadows moving behind the windows. I can hear voices, but I cannot make out the words. Finally, the door opens and people start filing out. I recognize a few faces. One neighbor stops and says, "They voted to fine you $2,000 for defamatory statements and disruptive conduct." I say, "What?" He says, "Linda made a motion and 3 board members voted yes." I say, "They cannot fine me without a hearing." He says, "They said the executive session was the hearing." I say, "I was not allowed to attend." He says, "I know, that is what I said, but they did not care." I say, "Did anyone object?" He says, 2 board members voted no, but the other 3 went along with Linda." I say, "Who are the 2 who voted no?" He says, "Mike and Janet." I say, "Thank you." He nods and walks to his car. I pull out my phone and I call Mark the lawyer. He does not answer. I leave a message. I say, "Mark, the board just held an executive session without giving me notice or allowing me to attend, and they voted to fine me $2,000. I need to talk to you as soon as possible." I hang up. I get in my car and I drive home. When I get there, the orange reflective marker is still at my curb. I take another photo. I go inside and I open my laptop. I finish the complaint to the state. I attach the recording of Linda calling the police. I attach a statement from the neighbor who told me about the vote. I attach the bylaws showing the notice requirement and the hearing requirement. I hit send. Then I open my email and I send another message to the entire neighborhood. I say, "Tonight the board held an executive session without proper notice and voted to fine me $2,000 without allowing me to attend or respond. This is a violation of the bylaws and a violation of my rights as a homeowner. I am sharing this so you are aware of how the board operates. If this can happen to me, it can happen to you." I encourage everyone to attend the next regular board meeting and to demand accountability. I include the date and time of the next meeting. I hit send. Within minutes, my phone starts ringing again. The next morning, I get a call from Mark. He says, "I got your message. This is bad." I say, "I know." He says, "The board cannot fine you without giving you notice and an opportunity to respond." I say, "That is what I told them." He says, "Did you record the meeting?" I say, "I recorded Linda calling the police, and I have a witness who told me about the vote." He says, "That is good." He says, "I am going to draft a demand letter to the board and the management company. The letter will say that the fine is void because it was imposed without due process, and if they do not withdraw it within 10 days, you will file a lawsuit for abuse of authority and violation of the bylaws." I say, "How much will that cost?" He says, "The demand letter is $500. I say, "I can do that." He says, "If they do not respond and you need to file a lawsuit, we are looking at $5,000 to $10,000 depending on how far it goes." I say, "I do not have that." He says, "You might not need it. A lot of HOAs back down when they get a demand letter from a lawyer because they know they will lose." I say, "Linda does not back down." He says, "Then we will cross that bridge when we get there." I say, "Okay, draft the letter." He says, "I will send it to you for review by end of day." He hangs up. I sit there, staring at my phone, and I realize I am about to spend $500 I do not have to fight a $2,000 fine I should not have received in the first place. I open my laptop, and I look at my bank account. I have $1,800. If I pay Mark, I will have $1,300. If the board does not back down, and I need to hire him for the lawsuit, I am going to be broke. I close the laptop. I go outside. The post hole digger is still leaning against the pile of dirt. The orange reflective marker is still at my curb. I look at the street. I see a car slow down, and the driver looks at my house. I wave. The driver does not wave back. The car keeps going. I realize people are watching. The neighborhood knows what is happening. Some of them are on my side. Some of them are on Linda's side. Some of them just want the drama to end. I go back inside and I wait for Mark's email. That afternoon, I get a knock on my door. It is Linda. She is holding a clipboard, and she has someone with her, a man in a suit. She says, "This is our attorney. His name is David." I say, "Hello?" David nods. He does not smile. Linda says, "We are here to inform you that the board has voted to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines and assessments." I say, "What fines?" She says, $500 per day for 7 days, plus the $2,000 conduct fine, plus a $500 administrative fee. I do the math in my head. That is $6,000. I say, I am not paying any of that. Linda says, "You do not have a choice. The lien has been filed with the county and it is now a matter of public record." I say, "You cannot file a lien without giving me notice and an opportunity to cure." She says, "We sent you notice." I say, "When?" She says, "We mailed it 3 days ago." I say, "I never received it." She says, "That is not our problem." David speaks for the first time. He says, "The lien is valid under Alaska law and under the covenants. If you do not pay the full amount within 30 days, the HOA has the right to foreclose." I say, "Foreclose?" He says, "Yes." I say, "You are going to try to take my house over a fence dispute?" He says, "We are enforcing the covenants." I say, "The covenants do not allow you to impose fines without due process." He says, "The board has the authority to interpret and enforce the covenants." I say, "I have a lawyer too." He says, "Good, have your lawyer contact me." He hands me a business card. He and Linda turn and walk away. I stand there holding the business card and I feel my heart pounding. I close the door. I call Mark. He answers. I say, "They just showed up at my door with a lawyer and told me they filed a lien on my house for $6,000. He says, "What?" I say, "They are claiming I owe fines and they are threatening to foreclose if I do not pay within 30 days. He says, "They cannot do that. You have not had a hearing." I say, "They said they mailed me notice." He says, "When?" I say, 3 days ago. He says, "You did not receive it?" I say, "No." He says, "That is good. If they did not provide proper notice, the lien is invalid." I say, "How do we prove that?" He says, "We file a motion to release the lien and we argue that you were not given notice or an opportunity to cure." I say, "How long does that take?" He says, "It depends on the court, but it could be a few weeks." I say, "Mark, I do not have a few weeks. They are going to keep escalating." He says, "I know. That is why I am going to file an emergency motion and request a hearing within 7 days. I say, "How much is that going to cost?" He says, "Another 1,000. I say, "I do not have another 1,000. He says, "Do you have anything?" I say, "I have 500 left after I pay for the demand letter." He says, "Give me the 500 and I will do what I can." I say, "Thank you." He says, "Send me copies of everything. The lien notice if you ever receive it, the violation notices, the fine notices, and the email chain." I say, "I have it all." He says, "Good, send it now." I hang up. I go to my laptop and I scan everything, and I email it to Mark. Then I sit there and I stare at the screen, and I think about what just happened. Linda and her lawyer showed up at my door and told me they are going to take my house. Over a fence. Over a fence I have not even built. That night, I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about the lien. I keep thinking about foreclosure. I keep thinking about Linda's face when she told me the lien was filed. She was smiling. Not a big smile, just a little smirk, like she won. I get up and I go to my laptop. I open the county recorder's website and I search for my property. There it is. A lien filed by the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association for $6,000. The filing date is yesterday. I download a copy. I read it. It says I owe fines and assessments for violations of the covenants, and the lien is being filed pursuant to Alaska Statutes Title 34, Chapter 8, which governs liens. I look up the statute. It says a homeowners association can file a lien for unpaid assessments, but it does not say anything about fines. I read further. It says the association must follow its own collection procedures before filing a lien, and it must provide the homeowner with notice and an opportunity to cure. I read the covenants. They say the board can impose fines for violations, but the fines must be imposed after a hearing, and the homeowner must be given written notice at least 10 days before the hearing. I never got notice. I never got a hearing. I take screenshots of everything. I email them to Mark. I also email them to the State Consumer Protection Unit. Then I draft another email to the neighborhood. I say, the board has filed a lien on my property for $6,000 in fines that were imposed without notice or a hearing. This is a violation of Alaska law and a violation of the covenants. I am sharing this so you know what the board is capable of. If you have received fines or liens from the HOA, please reach out to me. I hit send. Within an hour, I have 5 responses. All of them say they have been fined or threatened with liens. One person says they paid $3,000 in fines because they were afraid of foreclosure. Another person says they are currently fighting a lien and they have spent $5,000 on legal fees. Another person says they sold their house and moved because they could not deal with the HOA anymore. I forward all of the emails to Mark and to the state. Then I sit there and I realize this is bigger than me. This is not just about my fence. This is about a board that is using fines and liens to control homeowners and extract money. This is about Linda using the HOA as a personal weapon. This is about a management company that is enabling all of it. The next morning, Rick calls me. He says, "I heard about the lien." I say, "How did you hear?" He says, "Linda is bragging about it." I say, "Where?" He says, "She posted on the board members only group chat that she finally got you to back down." I say, "I have not backed down." He says, "I know, but she thinks you will." I say, "She is wrong." He says, "I believe you." He says, "I have something else for you." I say, "What?" He says, I pulled all the permits for fence projects in the reserve for the past 3 years. I say, "How did you do that?" He says, "I went to the city planning office and I requested copies." I say, "And?" He says, "Linda has been filing complaints with the city on every fence project that gets permitted. She claims the fences violate setback rules or height limits, and she demands inspections." I say, "Does the city follow up?" He says, "Sometimes, but most of the time they close the complaints because the fences are compliant." I say, "So she is wasting city resources." He says, "Yeah, and she is harassing homeowners." I say, "Do you have copies of the complaints?" He says, "Yes, I am sending them now." I hang up and I check my email. Rick has sent me a PDF with 20 complaints filed by Linda over 3 years. Every complaint targets a fence project. Every complaint claims a violation. Every complaint is signed by Linda as the landscaping committee lead. I read through them. Most of them were closed by the city with a finding of no violation. A few resulted in minor corrections like moving a post 6 inches. None of them resulted in a fence being removed. I forward the file to Mark. I also forward it to the state. Then I sit down and I think about what this means. Linda has been filing false complaints with the city for years. She has been using her position on the board to harass homeowners and interfere with permitted projects. And the management company has been letting her do it. That afternoon, I get an email from Mark. He says, "I filed the emergency motion to release the lien and I requested a hearing. The court scheduled it for next week." I say, "That is fast." He says, "I argued that the lien was filed without due process and that you are at risk of irreparable harm if it is not released immediately. The judge agreed to expedite." I say, "What do I need to do?" He says, "Show up and be ready to testify. I will handle the legal arguments, but you need to be able to explain what happened, when you were notified, and why you believe the fines are invalid." I say, "I can do that." He says, "Bring copies of everything." I say, "I have a binder." He says, "Perfect." He hangs up. I sit there and I feel a little bit of hope. Maybe the judge will see what is happening. Maybe the judge will release the lien. Maybe I will get a chance to fight back. The hearing is in a small courtroom in downtown Anchorage. I show up 15 minutes early. Mark is already there. He is wearing a suit and he has a briefcase. He looks calm. I do not feel calm. I feel like I am about to throw up. Linda is there with David, the HOA's lawyer. They are sitting on the other side of the courtroom. Linda sees me and she smirks again. I ignore her. The judge comes in. She is an older woman with gray hair and glasses. She sits down and says, "This is an emergency motion to release a lien filed by the Reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace Association. Counsel for the homeowner, you may proceed." Mark stands up. He says, "Your Honor, my client is a homeowner who has been fined $6,000 by the HOA without notice or a hearing. The HOA filed a lien on his property without following its own bylaws or Alaska law. I am requesting that the court release the lien and order the HOA to provide my client with proper notice and a hearing before imposing any further fines." The judge looks at David. She says, "Counsel for the HOA, what is your response?" David stands up. He says, "Your Honor, the HOA followed all proper procedures. The homeowner was notified of the violations, he was given an opportunity to cure, and he refused. The fines were imposed at a board meeting, and the lien was filed in accordance with Alaska law." Mark interrupts. He says, Your Honor, the homeowner was not notified of the board meeting, he was not allowed to attend, and he was not given a hearing. The board held an executive session and imposed the fines without allowing him to respond. David says, the executive session was proper under the bylaws. Mark says, no, it was not. The bylaws require 48 hours notice and the homeowner was given no notice. David says, the board can waive notice in emergency situations. Mark says there was no emergency. The only emergency was the board trying to punish a homeowner for exercising his rights. The judge raises her hand. She says, I have read the pleadings and I have reviewed the bylaws. I agree with the homeowner. The board did not provide proper notice and the homeowner was not given a hearing. I am granting the motion to release the lien. The lien is void, and the HOA is ordered to remove it from the county records within 5 business days. I am also ordering the HOA to provide the homeowner with written notice of all charges and a hearing before the board before imposing any fines or assessments. If the HOA fails to comply, the homeowner may file a motion for contempt. David stands up. He says, Your Honor, the HOA respectfully requests an opportunity to be heard on the merits of the fines. The judge says you will have that opportunity at a hearing after you provide proper notice. This hearing is adjourned. She stands up and leaves. I sit there, stunned. Mark turns to me and says, You won. I say, What? He says, The lien is gone. I say, For real? He says, Yes, the judge ruled in your favor. I say, What happens now? He says, The HOA has to give you notice and schedule a hearing. At that hearing, you can present your evidence and challenge the fines. I say, What if they try to impose new fines? He says, They cannot, not without following the process. I say, Linda is not going to stop. He says, I know, but now you have a court order on your side. If she violates it, you can file for contempt and she could face penalties. I say thank you. He says, You did good. He packs up his briefcase and leaves. I stand up and I look at Linda. She is standing with David, and they are talking in low voices. She looks angry. I walk past her, and I do not say anything. I walk out of the courtroom, and I get in my car, and I sit there for a minute, and I breathe. I won. I actually won. The next day, I get an email from Sarah. It says the board is scheduling a hearing for 2 weeks from now, and I will receive formal notice by mail. The hearing will address all outstanding fines and violations, and I will be allowed to present evidence and respond. I forward the email to Mark. He replies and says, Good, start preparing. I say, What do I need to prepare? He says you need to be able to prove that no construction occurred, that you followed the rules, and that the board has been inconsistent in applying the fence policy. Bring the contractor statement. Bring the email chain showing coordination between Linda and Sarah. Bring the board minutes showing the policy change. And bring the city complaints showing Linda's pattern of harassment. I say, I have all of that. He says, Then you are ready. I hang up and I open the binder. I flip through the tabs. I have the contractor statement. I have the email chain. I have the board minutes. I have the city complaints. I have the photos. I have the recordings. I have statements from neighbors. I have everything. I close the binder and I tuck it under my arm. I go outside. The post hole digger is still there. The orange reflective marker is still there. I take one more photo of both. Then I call Rick and I say I need you at the hearing. He says, I will be there. The hearing is in the clubhouse meeting room. I show up early. Mark is with me. Rick is with me. The room is full of homeowners. I see faces I recognize from the emails and the phone calls. I see the neighbor who told me about Linda trying to buy his lot. I see the neighbor who paid $3,000 in fines. I see the neighbor who sold their house and moved. Linda is sitting at the front table with the other board members. Sarah is sitting off to the side. David, the HOA's lawyer, is sitting next to Linda. The board president, Linda, calls the meeting to order. She says, "We are here to address the violations and fines imposed on the homeowner at Lot 47. She does not say my name, she just says Lot 47. She says, "The homeowner has requested a hearing and the board is granting that request." She says, "The homeowner may present his evidence and then the board will deliberate and issue a ruling." I stand up. Mark stands up with me. He says, "Your Honor, I am representing the homeowner." Linda says, "I am not a judge." Mark says, "Madam President, I am representing the homeowner and I would like to start by entering evidence into the record." Linda says, "This is not a court." Mark says, "This is a hearing, and the homeowner has a right to present evidence." Linda looks at David. David says, "Allow him to proceed." Linda says, "Fine." Mark opens his briefcase and he pulls out copies of the binder. He hands one to Linda, one to Sarah, and one to David. He says, "This binder contains all of the evidence supporting the homeowner's position. It includes the contractor statement confirming no construction occurred, the email chain showing coordination between the board and the management company, the board minutes showing the fence policy change was not announced to homeowners, the city complaints showing a pattern of harassment, and statements from neighbors confirming similar experiences." Linda flips through the binder. She does not look up. Mark says, "I would also like to call Rick Lawson as a witness." Rick stands up. Mark says, "Mr. Lawson, you are the contractor who was hired to build the fence, correct?" Rick says, "Correct." Mark says, "Did you perform any construction on the property?" Rick says, "No." Mark says, "Did you dig any post holes?" Rick says, "No." Mark says, "Did you set any posts?" Rick says, "No." Mark says, "What did you do?" Rick says, "I delivered equipment and I marked the fence line with stakes, but I did not start any work because the homeowner told me the HOA had not approved the plan yet." Mark says, "So no construction occurred?" Rick says, "Correct." Mark says, "Do you have documentation of that?" Rick says, "Yes, I have photos and timestamps showing the equipment was delivered but no work was performed." Mark hands copies of the photos to Linda, Sarah, and David. Linda looks at them. She says, "These photos do not prove anything." Mark says, "They prove that no construction occurred, which means the violation notice was false." Linda says, "The homeowner was preparing to construct without approval, which is a violation." Mark says, "Preparing is not the same as constructing, and the covenants do not prohibit preparation." Linda says, "The board interprets the covenants." Mark says, "The board cannot interpret the covenants in a way that contradicts the plain language." Linda says, "We are done with this witness." Mark says, "I am not done. I would like to ask Mr. Lawson about his prior experience with the board." Linda says, "That is not relevant." Mark says, "It is relevant because it shows a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority." Linda says, "I am instructing the witness not to answer." Mark says, "You cannot instruct the witness. This is a hearing and the homeowner has a right to present evidence." David stands up. He says, "Madam President, I recommend we allow the witness to answer." Linda glares at him. She says, "Fine." Mark says, "Mr. Lawson, have you worked on other projects in the reserve at Kingsbridge Terrace?" Rick says, "Yes." Mark says, Have you had interactions with the board or the landscaping committee? Rick says yes. Mark says, can you describe those interactions? Rick says, Linda King has interfered with multiple projects. She shows up on job sites, she demands changes to plans, she files complaints with the city, and she delays work until homeowners give up or comply with her demands. Mark says, do you have documentation of that? Rick says, yes. I have emails and photos. Mark says, I am entering those into the record. He hands more copies to Linda, Sarah, and David. Linda is not looking at the papers anymore. She is staring at me. Mark says, I am done with this witness. He sits down. Linda says, does the homeowner wish to speak? I stand up. I say yes. I say I moved to Anchorage 3 weeks ago. I submitted a fence plan 2 weeks ago. I followed all the rules in the covenants. I received an acknowledgement email saying the plan was under review. I did not receive approval, so I told my contractor not to start work. Linda showed up at my house and told me I was in violation before any work had been done. She told me I needed a notarized contractor letter that was not in the covenants. She told me the fence height was restricted to 5 feet in the side yard, which is not in the covenants. She fined me $500 per day for a violation that did not occur. She called the police and told them I was trespassing when I tried to attend a board meeting. She held an executive session without giving me notice and voted to fine me $2,000 without allowing me to respond. She filed a lien on my property without giving me a hearing. All of this is documented in the binder. I am asking the board to withdraw all fines, to approve my fence plan as submitted, and to adopt a policy requiring the board to give homeowners notice at a hearing before imposing fines or filing liens. I sit down. The room is silent. Linda looks at the other board members. She says, the board will deliberate. She stands up and the board members follow her into a side room. The door closes. Everyone in the audience starts talking. I hear people saying, she is going to lose. I hear people saying, this is going to change everything. I hear people saying, finally someone stood up to her. Mark leans over and says, you did great. I say, what happens now? He says, they will come back and issue a ruling. If they rule in your favor, the fines are gone and the plan is approved. If they rule against you, we file a lawsuit. I say, how long will that take? He says, months, maybe a year. I say, I cannot wait that long. He says, you might not have to. He nods toward the side room. He says, I think they know they lost. 10 minutes later, the door opens and the board members come back. Linda sits down. She does not look happy. She says, the board has deliberated and we have reached a decision. She says, the board finds that the violation notice was issued in error and the fines for construction without approval are withdrawn. The room erupts in applause. Linda raises her hand. She says, however, the board finds that the homeowner's conduct during the dispute was disruptive and detrimental to the community, and the $2,000 conduct fine remains in place. The applause stops. Mark stands up. He says, Madam President, that is unacceptable. The conduct fine was imposed without notice or a hearing, and the court has already ruled that the process was improper. If you do not withdraw the fine, we will file a motion for contempt. Linda says the court ruled on the lien, not on the fine. Mark says the court ruled that the homeowner must be given notice and a hearing before any fines are imposed. You have not provided a hearing on the conduct fine. Linda looks at David. David says he is correct. Linda says, fine, the conduct fine is withdrawn. The room erupts again. Linda says, the board also finds that the fence plan as submitted is approved, subject to the homeowner obtaining all necessary city permits. I stand up. I say, I already have the city permit. Linda says, then you may proceed. She says, this hearing is adjourned. She stands up and walks out. The other board members follow her. Sarah follows her. David stays behind and he walks over to Mark. He says, your client won. Mark says, I know. David says, Linda is not going to let this go. Mark says, if she retaliates, we will file a complaint. David says, I am not talking about legal retaliation, I am talking about personal retaliation. She has a long memory. Mark says, so do I. David nods and leaves. I look at Mark. I say, what did he mean? Mark says, he means Linda is going to make your life difficult in other ways. I say, how? He says, she will find other violations, she will slow down other approvals, she will make sure you are the first person she targets for anything. I say, that is harassment. He says, it is, but it is hard to prove unless she is obvious about it. I say, what do I do? He says, document everything, stay on top of the rules, and do not give her any openings. I say, I just want to build a fence. He says, I know. He packs up his briefcase and leaves. I stand there in the empty meeting room and I realize I won the battle, but the war is not over. 2 days later, Rick and his crew show up at my house. They start digging post holes. Linda does not show up. Sarah does not show up. No one from the HOA shows up. The work proceeds without interference. By the end of the week, the fence is up. It is 6 feet tall. It is exactly where it is supposed to be. It looks great. I take photos and I email them to Mark. He replies and says, congratulations. I reply and say, thank you for everything. He says, send me the final invoice when you get it and I will close the file. I say, what do I owe you? He says, you paid me $1,000 total. That covers the demand letter and the court motion. I say, that seems low. He says, I did not spend much time on it and honestly it was satisfying to watch Linda lose. I say, me too. I hang up and I go outside and I stand in my backyard and I look at the fence. It is just a fence. 6 feet of wood and posts. But it feels like more than that. It feels like proof that I did not back down. It feels like proof that the system can work if you push hard enough. I hear a car pull up. I walk around to the front yard. It is the neighbor who told me about Linda trying to buy his lot. He gets out and he walks over. He says, I heard you won. I say, yeah. He says, that is huge. I say, it does not feel huge, it feels exhausting. He says, I get that, but you did something no one else has done. You made Linda lose. I say, she is still on the board. He says, yeah, but now everyone knows she can be beaten. I say, what does that mean? He says, it means people are going to start pushing back. I say, that is good. He says, it is, and I want you to know that a bunch of us are going to run for the board in the next election. We are going to try to vote Linda out. I say, when is the election? He says, 6 months. I say, that is a long time. He says, it is, but we have momentum now. I say, let me know if I can help. He says, I will. He gets back in his car and drives away. I stand there and I look at the orange reflective marker Linda planted at my curb. I walk over and I pick it up. I carry it to the trash can and I drop it in. Then I go inside. A week later, I get an email from Sarah. It says the board has adopted a new policy requiring the board to publish all rule interpretations and policy changes to homeowners within 10 business days of adoption. The email also says the board is required to provide homeowners with written notice and a hearing before imposing fines or assessments. The email also says the board is adopting a new timeline for fence plan approvals, and all plans must be approved or denied within 30 days of submission. I read the email twice. I forward it to Mark. He replies and says, "You did that." I say, "What do you mean?" He says, "The board adopted those policies because of your complaint and because of the court order. You forced them to change." I say, "I did not think they would actually do it." He says, "They had to. The state was investigating, and the court was watching." I say, "So it worked." He says, "It worked." I sit there and I think about what that means. I took the fine notice without flinching, because I knew what it would trigger. I knew that if I pushed hard enough, if I documented everything, if I demanded my rights, the system would have to respond. And it did. I think about the email chain Rick sent me, Linda coordinating with Sarah to create policies. I think about the board meeting where they voted to interpret the covenants without homeowner input. I think about Linda showing up at my door and waving the laminated rule card. I think about her saying, "Your rights end where HOA authority begins." She was wrong. Authority ends where rights begin. And now the board has to publish standards and timelines to all homeowners. Now the board has to give notice and hearings. Now the board has to follow the rules they tried to use against me. The next board meeting is 3 weeks later. I show up. The room is packed. I see the neighbor who is organizing the election campaign. I see the neighbor who paid $3,000 in fines. I see Rick. I see faces I recognize from the emails. Linda is at the front table. She looks smaller than she did before. She does not look at me. The meeting starts. Linda reads the agenda. One of the items is rule interpretation transparency. Linda says, "The board has adopted a policy requiring publication of rule interpretations and a timeline for approvals." She does not say why. She does not mention my name. She just reads the policy and moves on. Then she opens the floor for homeowner comments. The neighbor who is organizing the election campaign stands up. He says, "I want to thank the board for adopting the transparency policy. I also want to say that many homeowners have expressed concern about the board's past practices. And we believe it is time for new leadership." Several people applaud. Linda says, "That is noted." Another neighbor stands up. She says, "I received a fine last year, and I paid it because I was afraid of a lien. After hearing what happened with Lot 47, I am requesting a refund." Linda says, "You will need to submit a written request." The neighbor says, "I am submitting it now." She walks up to the table and she hands Linda a piece of paper. Linda takes it and sets it down without looking at it. Another neighbor stands up. He says, "I want to know why Linda King filed 20 complaints with the city over 3 years and almost all of them were found to be without merit. Why is the HOA paying for her personal vendettas?" The room goes silent. Linda says, "I do not have to answer that." Mark, who is sitting in the back, stands up. He says, "Actually, you do. Homeowners have a right to question board actions, and filing false complaints is a misuse of HOA resources. Linda says, the complaints were not false. Mark says, the city records say otherwise. Do you want me to read them out loud? Linda looks at David. David is not there. Linda says, I was acting in my capacity as landscaping committee lead. Mark says, you were acting outside your authority and you were harassing homeowners. If the board does not address this, homeowners will have grounds to remove you for misconduct. Linda stands up. She says, I resign. The room explodes. People are shouting. Some are applauding. Some are asking questions. Linda walks out. Sarah stands up and says, the board will accept her resignation and will appoint an interim landscaping committee lead at the next meeting. The meeting is adjourned. Everyone stands up and starts talking. I sit there and I watch Linda walk out the door. I feel something I did not expect. I feel relieved. Not because she resigned, because it is over. That night, I get a text from Rick. It says, congratulations, you got her out. I reply, I did not do it alone. He says, you started it. I say, I just wanted to build a fence. He says, and you did. I go outside and I look at the fence. It is still there. 6 feet tall. Exactly where it is supposed to be. I think about everything that happened. The violation notice, the fines, the lien, the hearing, the court order, the resignation. I think about the email chain Rick sent me. Linda and Sarah coordinating to create policies. I think about how our records request exposed contradictions and edits. I think about how her own bluff got read out loud and the room reacted. I think about how the HOA must now publish standards and timelines to all homeowners. I think about how Karen tried to flex authority and the policy said she could not. I smile. I go inside. I sit down at my kitchen table and I open my laptop. I write an email to the neighborhood. I say, thank you to everyone who supported me during the fence dispute. Because of your willingness to speak up and share your experiences, the board has adopted new transparency policies and Linda King has resigned. This is a win for all of us. I encourage everyone to stay engaged, to run for the board, and to hold our leadership accountable. I hit send. I close my laptop. I lean back in my chair. It is over. I won. We won. A few weeks later, I get a letter in the mail. It is from the management company. It says the board has reviewed all outstanding fines and assessments from the past 3 years and has determined that several were imposed without proper notice or hearings. The board is issuing refunds to affected homeowners. I open the envelope. There is a check inside. It is for $6,000. I stare at it. I call Mark. He answers. I say I just got a refund check for $6,000. He says, that is the fines they withdrew. I say, they are actually refunding them? He says they have to. The court order required it. I say, I never asked for a refund. He says, the state did. After your complaint, the state opened an investigation and the board had to refund everyone who was fined without due process. I say, how many people? He says, I do not know, but I heard it was at least 20 homeowners. I say, that is a lot of money. He says, it is, and it is all because you did not back down. I say, thank you. He says, you are welcome. I hang up and I deposit the check. Then I sit down and I think about what just happened. I got my money back. Other people got their money back. The board changed its policies. Linda resigned. The neighborhood is organizing to vote out the rest of the old board. All because I stood in my front yard 3 months ago and refused to let Linda wave a laminated rule card in my face and tell me I could not build a fence. I take one more look at the fence through the window. It is still there. It always will be. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.